Hello and welcome to another Smaulgld podcast. Today is August 24th, 2019. And today's topic is Jackson Hole's other game-changing speech. Yesterday, we discussed in detail what happened in reaction to the big speech of the day at Jackson Hole, which was Federal Reserve Chairman Powell's speech, in which he outlined where he thought the direction of what the Fed may or may not do. The substance of his speech wasn't really the importance. It was the attention that was paid to it, not only by financial commentators and market participants, but by President Trump himself, who tweeted that he was shocked at the way Chairman Powell could give his speech, not knowing, talking about where the Fed was heading, not knowing what Trump was going to do in the trade war with China. So check that out. We discussed that yesterday in Is the Fed Really the Enemy? And yesterday's events had some clues to that. I'm not going to get into that today, but what we are going to talk about was an overlooked speech. I wouldn't say it's an important speech. It's important to note because the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who also used to be, I think, the governor of the Bank of Canada. It's amazing how these guys pop from one job to the other. Just like Christine Lagarde is going to probably become the ECB president of the ECB president after being in charge of the IMF. Now, Mark Carney gave a speech which I thought was inane and somewhat comical because he trotted out all of the cliches that we mock the gold pumpers for. Game changer, multipolar world, end of dollar hegemony, China's yuan is the world's reserve currency, and so on. Now, he didn't mention SDRs and he didn't mention COMEX default or backing the yuan with gold, but it was a very, very similar type of speech and where he outlined where he thought things were headed. I don't know who wrote this for him or he actually believes this, but let's just go through the speech. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it is humorous to watch him or to listen to him or to read some of the stuff that he said was straight out of the gold pumper hyperbole about why you should buy gold because we're in a multipolar world and China is going to crush the dollar and the dollar is going to collapse and we live in a multipolar world. It's a game changer. Check out what Carney said. I'll pull out I'll link to it too. I'm not making this up. He actually trotted out all of these cliches. So there he is. Bank of England speech, the growing challenges for the monetary policy in the current international monetary and financial system. This was given yesterday at Jackson Hole by Mark Carney. And here's how he lays out his talk. He lays it out. There's things that the banks have to consider in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. So we've got heightened economic policy uncertainty, and in the short term, the bankers must play the cards they've been dealt with the best they can. That's all you ever can do. And he gives his old gibberish talk. And then he talks about the medium term. Here's the medium term. That policymakers need to reshuffle the deck. We need to improve the structure of the current IMFS. This requires ensuring that institution at the heart of market-based finance, blah, blah, blah. Just nonsense. Better surveillance across border spillovers, macro-prudential. It's just gibberish here. But in the longer term, now we get to the substance. We need to change the game. We need a game changers. We cannot reform this overnight, or market forces aren't not necessarily going to likely force a rapid switch of reserve assets. But equal blithe acceptance of the status quo is misguided. Risks are building and they are structural. And then he does one of the old, another type of cliche, similar to the one, it doesn't matter until it does. He says in economics, things take longer to happen than you think they will, and then they happen faster than you thought they could. Very dramatic there, so it's showing that he's very insightful and he can cite cliches. So longer term, they need to change the game. They need a game changer. Now, let's see what those game-changing ideas would be. Well, then he goes into a little history of economic, financial, global systems The U.S. at first was an unwilling hegemon. Yes, the United States has this entire hegemonic control over world finances, and of course that's not a good thing because they're part of the 1%. All right, then he goes in and explains why that's not a good thing, and they start talking about how they need to change the game, and he's got an underline. That's not my underline. They need to change the game. When it comes to change, you see, it shouldn't be to swap one currency hegemon, the dollar, for another. Any unipolar system is unsuited to a multipolar world. So there it is. Multipolar world, end of dollar hegemony. And we would do well to think through every opportunity, including those presented by new technologies. Okay, but before getting into the technologies, he throws out there that it could be the game-changing Chinese yuan. Now, this is ludicrous. When you still talk about the Chinese yuan being the world's reserve currency, even China knows that this isn't going to happen. It's not one of China's. It's in like the top 24 things that China would like to accomplish over the next 50 years. It's not at the top of their list because at the top of their list is knowing they need to have full control over the yuan and they can't be concerned about what the rest of the world thinks of it. So, for example, they have capital controls. They can devalue the yuan when it makes sense for them to do so. You can't really do that as a world's reserve currency. The transaction reporting on the yuan is horrible. People don't understand what's going on in China. The reporting is far less trustworthy than the United States. It's subject to devaluation. They have massive debt. Massive amount of debt. Internal debt that no one really understands. And not to mention, if you're going to take into account all of these international standards of ethics, well, China is a surveillance state. It has human rights violations. Some say it's running concentration camps. So the idea that the yuan is going to be accepted as the world reserve currency is not only far-fetched, it's actually going in the other direction. The amount of reserves held by central banks in Chinese yuan is under 2 or 3%. It hasn't grown in 10 years. Why? For the reasons I just gave. It is not an attractive currency. But that doesn't stop Mark Carney from trotting out, changing the game from a unipolar to a multipolar world and ending dollar hegemony. And the most likely candidate for true reserve currency status, the RMB. And he says there's a long way to go before it's ready to assume the mantle. I don't think it's ever going to assume the mantle, but the building blocks are already there. And China is already the world's leading trading nation, overtaking the U.S. at the start of this decade. And the RMB is now more common than sterling in oil futures benchmarks. That's because sterling is not that common in oil future benchmarks. Anyway, despite having no share in the market prior to 2018. And then he talks about, I forgot, my Belt and Road. Yes. The Belt and Road Initiative could foster further uptake of the RMB in both trade and finance. The Belt and Road is going in the other direction. Countries are canceling out of the Belt and Road. I don't know who wrote this speech for this guy because he's not making a stitch of sense, and he's just pumping old news here about the China and crushing the dollar and my Belt and Road and game changer, multipolar world. It's just full of all of these cliches. Then he talks about Libra. Now, Libra, he's just throwing out there that history shows the rise of a reserve currency is founded on its usefulness as a medium of exchange, of which the Chinese RMB has none. In fact, the whole gold-backed yuan game changer was that no one would want to accept the yuan as payment for oil. But they would accept it only if they can bring it over to the Shanghai Gold Exchange and get their yuan exchange for gold, which was total nonsense. You can't do that. That's not happening. So the idea of the reserve currency being founded on usefulness as a medium of exchange does not apply to the Chinese game-changing yuan. Nor does it apply to Libra. Why? He says the most high-profile of these has been Libra, a new payments infrastructure based on international stablecoin, fully backed by reserve assets in a basket of currency, including the U.S. dollar. First of all, it's not a new payments infrastructure. It doesn't exist. They're trying to come up with it. It has no usefulness as a medium exchange. It has not been approved anywhere, and it includes the dollar, the euro, and the sterling. It could be exchanged between users on messaging platforms with participating retailers. So now he's predicting that it's going to be the Chinese yuan, or possibly, not possibly, he's basically saying that Libra exists. And this has the potential to disrupt network externalities to prevent the incumbent global reserve currency from being displaced. And he talks about Libra and all the challenges of Libra. A third grader could have written this better. Okay, then he says, even if the initial variants of the idea prove wanting, the concept is intriguing. He's talking about this idea that whether central banks can come up with their own synthetic hegemonic currency, which he calls SHC, which would be best provided by the public sector through the network of central bank digital currencies. So to compete with Libra, which doesn't exist, the banks may create their own network of central bank digital currencies called synthetic hegemonic currencies. And then this would have a problem because it might run up against the new hegemonic reserve currency like the RMB. And this is just all pure, like if this happens and if it's this and if it's that, and maybe if it's this and we create a synthetic hegemonic currency to compete with Libra, and then while it might compete with the RMB, and I am the head of the Bank of England. So the synthetic hegemonic currency could dampen the domineering influence of US dollars on global trade, i.e. end dollar hegemony through synthetic hegemonic currency, which might be able to replace the new hegemonic reserve currency like the RMB, the Chinese yuan. Well, what else? I think there's a little bit more gibberish and we're done. Yeah, that's it. That's all. I just wanted to throw that out there. This game-changing speech given by Mark Carney. I pay it no mind. He's not going to get... I don't even know what... He's not suggesting this as policy. He's fantasizing like he's got a YouTube channel, I think. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. Join me tonight. We're going to have Saturday Night Silver. I'm going to go through a lot of the metrics in the silver market. Have a good night.